Hello, welcome to the keynote talk session. I'm Mikio Nakano, one of the program chairs. Before starting the session, let me explain about questions and answers in the keynote talk sessions. You're invited to post questions or comments in the chat and upvote the ones you like. So the chair will select and ask questions so that the recorded video becomes anonymous. So if you have questions afterwards, you can still write your questions through Ribbon. Okay, let's start. The first keynote speaker of ICMI 2020 is Professor Dr. Asli Ozyurek. It's my pleasure to introduce her. Asli Ozyurek is a professor at the Faculty of Humanities at Radboud University, Nijmegen, and a principal investigator and a board member at Donder's Institute for Brain, Behavior, and Cognition at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. She is the director of the Multimodal Language and Cognitive Lab. She completed her BA in psychology at Bogazici University in Istanbul, Turkey, and earned a double PhD degree in psychology and linguistics from University of Chicago. She has received many career grants. She is an elected member of Academia Europaea, and she has received an Aspasia Award from Dutch Science Foundation and Young Scientist Award from Turkish Science Foundation. Our research focuses on the role that language plays as a dynamic, adaptive, and flexible system in human cognition and communication. Today, she is going to talk with the title, From Hands and Brains, How Does Human Body Talk, Think, and Interact in Face-to-Face Language Use? I'm sure our talk will be very stimulus to the ICM community, and so I'm very excited. So let's welcome Asli Ozyurek.
Okay, thank you. I need to share my screen, right? Okay. Can everyone see it now? I think it's okay. Okay, well, hello everyone. I find it still odd not to see anyone while you're giving a talk, but I assume you're all there. I would like to thank Mikio, first of all, for this nice introduction, and everybody in the audience and the conference organizers for inviting me to this rather interesting group of people and conference. And thanks for being here in these challenging circumstances. I'm really looking forward to meet all of you and learn about what you're doing and see if there could be overlaps, further interactions between what I'm doing and what you're doing, because as I understand, you're mostly working on, or some of you are working on human-computer interactions, artificial agents, and these are the areas, and I hope my work can inform some of your work. Today I will talk about how multimodality is recruited, used, and processed, in particular during face-to-face language use by humans, and the cognitive and neural underpinnings of this process revealed from experimental and psycholinguistic work. As you all know, in face-to-face interaction, we use not only vocal modality, but also such as speech, but also all kinds of other visual and visible bodily articulators, such as hand gestures, eye gaze, lip movements, facial expressions that accompany in different ways to the messages we convey in our spoken utterances. That language is multimodal in nature. At least it was the case till the pandemic, but unfortunately, after COVID, a lot of the multimodal cues that we use in linguistic interactions have been constrained. And this is due to wearing masks, social distancing, and having to use the online platforms like this do not allow us to use the full potential of our multimodal capacity. But I would like to claim is that because human language has evolved to be multimodal in nature, in evolution, it allows us, this multimodal ability allows us also to will adapt us to these new situations as well and survive eventually. And I will get back to this issue later in the talk as well. Even though the idea that language use is multimodal might be trivial to many of you in this audience, if you come from a linguistic or even psycholinguistic perspective, this is not so trivial. And this is something I've struggled all my life in the last 20 years. So the research tradition in linguistics, starting from Saussure, Chomsky, Hawkwood, Fodor, etc., they have mostly considered a subset of our communication as linguistic. So these are the, and they have focused on certain features of our communication situations. So these are the features that see on the left side of the column. For example, they have mostly considered spoken and written aspects of language as really linguistics, and they have ignored the visible aspects, such as what we do with our hands and facial expressions and lips and etc. And they have also focused mostly on the arbitrary signals, arbitrary form meaning mappings, and also the categorical ones that, for example, can be expressed by phonemes and morphemes. And in this way, they have again excluded the iconic and indexical representations that are conveyed through our body, let's say from our hands or from our face, because these are hard to categorize. They have also considered language mostly to be a linear system, because it's the case when we just look at spoken and written language. And they have ignored the simultaneous nature of human communication, because as we use multiple articulators, we can express information simultaneously from different articulators. And they have also considered language to be a static system, also probably inspired by the fact that written language is static. And they have not considered the evolving, interactive, and dynamic aspects of language. What I will claim in this talk is that we need to consider and understand how elements in both columns coexist and interact with each other in human language use. That's both sides of the coin if we want to understand human language system fully and how it can be used adaptively in different contexts and languages. So in order to do this, I work within a model of multimodal language use and processing. And in this model, I assume and try to find evidence, and I have done so in the last 20 years or so, that humans, when they are the language producers, they use multimodal articulators, and when they do so, they integrate them in their message. So all articulators that we use from our hands, from our speech, lips, eye gaze, they're all integrated and part of one system. And they use all of these articulators with certain communicative intent. And the listeners and viewers in return also integrate these messages together to perceive the the intended communicative message of the speaker. And I also try to understand the cognitive and the neurobiological underpinnings of this system, both from the production and the comprehension side. So as you know, multimodal language is very broad. And in this talk, I will mostly focus on the hand gestures and the speech, and what I call these as the visible reference. Because some of the ways that we can convey information with our hands they cannot be encoded like that by using the vocal modality, that's speech. So in that sense, they are very unique and they have extra representational and information conveying capacities that we cannot do through speech. So some of these gestures we call in the field as iconic gestures. And these gestures are quite interesting because they bear some kind of size, shape, motion resemblance to the events that we talk about. For example, when someone is talking about opening a jar, she can do an opening jar gesture, mimicking opening a jar, and we would call this an iconic gesture. Or if someone is talking about emotion, like a cat hopping across the street, he could mimic the movement of this cat zigzagging and going across a path, for example. In addition to iconic gestures, we can also use indexical gestures, and these are also just specific to the visual modality that we cannot do with vocal modality. And these are, pointings to things around us. For example, this child, when he says this word, he can point to the writing on the board. Or we can also use abstract pointing gestures. We can point to abstract spaces around our body if we want to, locate some people or objects in our narratives, for example. So these visible references, again, they have different representational formats to the speech, but I will try to show you evidence that they are used as part of an integrated system with the spoken modality. And I will specifically focus on iconic gestures in this talk, but in my lab, we have also done research on other types of gestures, and I'm happy to take questions on those as well. So there are different views on the role of iconic gestures in language processing. According to some views, these gestures are direct representations of imagery, because they reflect the embodied simulations of sensory-motor experience while we speak. For example, the woman I showed you before, when she says, oh, she opened the jar and she does this enacting, this gesture is driven from this simulation of the motion that she is talking about. And gestures are just reflections of this simulation. But they are not necessarily communicatively intended. They are like a byproduct of the simulation. And they are also, in this case, then not produced integrated with language, or they are not part of the language production system, but an independent simulation system. And in the brain, they should also recruit mostly motor and visual areas involved in simulations, but not necessarily language-specific areas. As opposed to this view, there's also the language gesture interface view that I will advocate today. In this view, gestures, they could be driven by some simulation process, but in this process, they also interact with language production and comprehension systems. So they are not an independent, but an integrated system. And because they are part of the language system, they have also evolved through evolution to be communicatively intended system from the beginning. Because speech is, if speech is communicative, then gestures are also as likely communicative system. And they recruit similar brain areas and processes involved in language processing, maybe in addition to recruiting motor and visual areas. So in this talk, first part of the talk, I will show you how speakers produce multimodal utterances and how they do them in integrating them in both speech and gesture, and how they are communicative, provide you some evidence that actually they are communicatively intended, but they are not some, like, windows into the unconscious processes of speakers, as has been assumed by some popular theories of gesture. And in the second part of the talk, I will go into how actually listeners process information coming from multiple modalities in different formats, the visual and vocal formats, and how they unite them together. Okay, so if you want to understand or prove that iconic gestures are not mere simulations, but they are part of an interactive system with language processing, one way to test this is to look at whether iconic gestures of the same events look similar or not in languages where there are different ways of expressing the same event. So we know that languages have different grammatical systems and the same events can be expressed in different ways. So if gestures about the same imagery look different in different languages, then we can say that gestures are not merely simulations of events, but actually from their production, they are integrated with how language encodes and packages events. So to test this, we have asked English speakers on the one hand and Turkish and Japanese speakers to view some events in the context of a cartoon event, Sylvester and Twitter cartoons, and we have asked them to talk about them. So in some of these scenes, there are simultaneous manner and path components. So especially in a scene where we have noticed this effect, Sylvester has swallowed a bowling ball thrown on him by the cat, the Tweety, and because he swallowed this big ball, then he rolls down the street and he runs into a bowling alley. It's a funny scene. So English speakers talk about this scene, the both manner and path, in one verbal clause. So manner is expressed in the main verb and path is in the prepositional phrase. Turkish and Japanese speakers, on the other hand, they have to use separate verbs for the manner and the path. So they express the path in the main verb and the manner in the subordinate. So our idea was that if one processing unit in language is a verbal clause, and if gestures are produced in line with language production process, or they are shaped by this, then Turkish and Japanese speakers would have to use two gestures, one for manner, one for path, whereas English speakers, they could package both manner and path in one gesture, which would be one processing unit for English speakers. And actually, that's what we found. So English speakers mostly express manner and path of this rolling down event in one gesture, as you can see here. I hope the video.
He rolls down a street into a bowling alley.
Okay, so then you could see that there's the rolling and the going along information. However, a Japanese speaker would gesture differently. We use separate gestures for each component. And Turkish speakers like the Japanese speaker. Okay, so as you can see here, gestures then do not seem to be produced merely by the simulation of the event, because if it was, then it would be the same in all languages, but rather they seem to be packaged and influenced by the language processing information. However, looking at these examples, you could say, oh, but this is just an example from behavior. Maybe there were some other reasons why these things happen. So it doesn't necessarily show that gestures are produced by conceptualization for speaking. So we don't know if they were planned like this before language production.
He rolls down a street into a.
So in order to test whether gestures are shaped by linguistic conceptualization of messages before even language starts, we used an eye-tracking paradigm. So eye-tracking paradigms have been used in psycholinguistics to find out how people plan and conceptualize their messages for their speech planning. For example, there's been a lot of interest in cross-linguistic work showing that, for example, speakers like Turkish, where path is expressed in the main verb, they look at the path of an event before they are going to talk about this event. So they already, while they are planning, they know that they are going to talk about this event. They already start looking at the path because the main path is in the main verb expresses the path. Whereas speakers of manner verbs like English, they look at the manner more than the path. However, this evidence has been there for spoken languages, but we didn't know whether this would also work for gestures. So people, when they do language-specific gestures, do they also show these differences in their eye tracking? So we have just finished this study with Ercan Ünal and Francine Manhart, and we have just submitted it. So what we did is we asked Turkish speakers to look at such events and talk about them as we did before. And we recorded their eyes while they looked at the event. And then we looked at what they said and what they gestured and see if there's a correlation. So because Turkish is a path language where path information is encoded in the main verb, and that's exactly what they did. For example, in this talking about this event, the Turkish speaker says, as walking enters a tent. And when he says enters, he also uses a path gesture. So you can see it's in Turkish.
Yürüyerek çardak gibi bir yere giriyor.
Okay. Walking enters a tent. And as the most common pattern we have seen in these examples is that there was a path in the main verb and a path gesture. So our prediction is that if gestures are also planned by conceptualization, language-specific conceptualization of the event, then if they produce a path gesture, they would look at the path in the event even more than when they produced only speech encoding path. And so we also specified some areas, regions of interest for eyes. We looked at whether people looked at the more path than manner, or they looked at more manner than the path. So what you can see here is that the above lines are path preference over manner preference. And because Turkish is a more path language than as previous research, there is more preference for looking at the path. But what's important for us is that when people produced a gesture, in addition to their speech, accompanying their speech, then they looked at the path even more. And when they just used speech only, they again looked at the path, but this effect was enhanced when they used a gesture. So this shows us an independent evidence from eye tracking in the pre-verbal planning stage that production of gesture is planned and informed by language-specific conceptualization of pre-verbal messages. So, and this also then goes against the mere simulation idea. If gestures were influenced by just simulation of an experience independent of language, we wouldn't have seen this extra effect. So then so I've shown you some evidence that gestures are produced within the language production system, but it doesn't tell us that gestures are necessarily communicatively intended. So I've mentioned you already that there are a lot of theories out there that see gestures as secret windows into somebody's thoughts, and there has been civilian studies that try to look at people's hands to see if they are lying, for example, or politicians' speeches like gestures of Trump or whatever. There are a lot of popular videos out there that try to get some, unintended ideas expressed in Trump's gestures than what he said. So actually what in the popular theories, what people's gestures convey is considered to be something like they are hiding from their speech. So speech and gesture are seen as disconnected. However, when we look at data or we put people in different communicative situations, we see that actually gestures are really communicatively intended. So to, we have done a lot of different paradigms on this, but in one of the paradigms that I like most, we have asked Italian speakers in Sicily to explain how to make coffee to a camera, but imagining different addresses. So in one case, we ask them to imagine an adult who already knows how to make coffee. And in another case, we ask them to imagine a 12-year-old child who doesn't know how to make coffee. So of course, the kind of coffee that Italians use is the cafetera style espresso. So it's a very embodied event. And so if gestures are result of embodied simulations, then in all cases, no matter what kind of addressee you're imagining, you would see a lot of embodied gestures. However, this was not the case. We found that the more there was increase in the communicative intent, for example, when they thought that they were describing how to make coffee to a child, then they had more communicative intent, then they had more iconic gestures, and these iconic gestures were more informative. They were richer, they were both-handed, and they had more information in them when they were considered to be done for a child versus for an adult. We've also found similar effects in terms of different people with different common grounds, or even when people are in face-to-face situations. So here you can see that when this speaker is talking about when the coffee goes up from the bottom part of the cafeteria to the upper part, this is the part they are talking about. He's talking about in both contexts. But when he thinks he's talking to an adult, he makes a gesture, but this is not an iconic gesture. Here you can see. Okay, he says the coffee goes up, but then he does this kind of, oh, you know what I mean gesture. But if he thinks he's talking to a child, he produces an iconic gesture. Okay, so then this shows us that that when an iconic gesture is produced and how it is produced is probably shaped by the communicative intent, and in addition to the linguistic effects that they have that I have shown you before. In a separate study, because in this study we had to code everything by hand, and the informativeness of gesture was not very precise in our coding. We also did a replication, and people told us this is like Italians gesturing all the time. We have done a follow-up study by James Triolo using more advanced measurement techniques using Kinect. And we asked Dutch people to perform some simple actions, for example, opening the lid of a pen, either to do it like an action, really giving them a pen and making them open the lid, in a more versus less communicative context, or in other cases, we have asked them to use their gestures as if they are opening the lid of a pen or not. And again, in a more or less communicative context. And we recorded their movements with Kinect to see which aspects of these communicative movements are shaped by the communicative intentions. And again, they were looking at the camera, and they were informed that in one case, somebody was listening to them. In another case, there was somebody else in another room, but they weren't really interested in what they are doing. So the results, again, were very similar to our cafeteria study because we found that, for example, the distance that the hands traveled in the more communicative situation was more in the communicative situation than in the less communicative situation. And also the mean amplitude, peak velocity, and the sub-movements were more in the communicative situation. For example, the movements were more chopped, for example, when it was meant to be in a communicative context, so that it made it easier to understand, probably. And also, we also found them to be looking more at the camera in the communicative situation than in the less communicative situation. So this gives us also more independent and objective evidence that the production of gestures can be shaped by the communicative intentions. Okay, so then all these multimodal intended messages, multimodal utterances, how are they then perceived by the listeners? Do people also pay attention to all aspects that they see in these hand gestures and integrate them with what they hear, or are they actually focusing on one modality? Because you could think that, you know, sometimes there's so much information and you can only focus on one and not the other, and etc. So now I'll tell you about how these multimodal messages are perceived and processed by the listeners. Again, in an experimental paradigm, we first wanted to see whether seeing iconic gestures interact with speech comprehension. So when you see the same message, both speech and gesture, does it influence your speech and speech influence gesture and vice versa, or are you paying attention to two modalities in different ways? So in order to answer this question, we gave subjects some action movies first, like someone tripping an action. And these movies then were followed by speech and gesture pairs about these actions. And these speech gesture pairs were sometimes matching with each other, and sometimes they were mismatching. So now I'll show you one little video and a subject would see. First the action and then the speech gesture pairs. And in this case, the speech gesture would be matching each other. So speech would be about chop, and then gesture would also be about chopping. So this would be a description of the action they have seen.
Chop.
Okay. So seeing this speech and gesture part of the movie, later they had to decide whether what they heard, which would be chop, matched the action that they have seen, and they have to press a yes or no button. So as I said, in one condition, speech and gesture, they saw they were matching, but in the other two conditions, they were actually mismatching. So in one condition, for example, they would hear chop, but they would see a cutting gesture, like we see here.
Chop.
So here, speech and gesture are mismatching, but they still somewhat overlapping because they are both about cutting something into pieces and etc. So in the third condition, we made the speech gesture mismatch completely different from each other. So they would hear the word chop, but they would see a gesture like opening a jar.
Chop.
Okay. So as I said, in all of these cases, the speech was exactly the same, and their task was to decide whether what they heard matched the event that they have seen. So they didn't have to take gesture into consideration. But if seeing gesture automatically is integrated with speech comprehension, then we would expect people to make more errors in the mismatching conditions than the matching conditions. And furthermore, we would expect more errors in strong mismatches than in weak mismatches. And actually, that's exactly what we found. So people made more errors, so they couldn't decide that what they heard was actually chop. So maybe they heard that they heard twist or something like this. So they made more errors in the mismatch condition than in the other matching condition or weakly mismatching condition. So this is something like a, McGurk effect that we see with the lips and syllables mismatching. However, we don't know actually what people thought that they heard. We don't have information in the context of this experiment, but because they thought that they didn't hear chop, it suggests that gesture had influence with what they heard. So there was an interference of McGurk effect and at the multimodal semantic level. So now, like going to the neural correlates of this speech and gesture comprehension, we can also ask whether speech and gesture comprehension share similar brain areas and processes. So actually, if they did, this would make this integration much more plausible and easier. So in order to answer this question, we use some online neural processing, such as ERPs, and as well as some imaging experiments to see which brain areas people use, what type of neural processes they use when they process gesture, and they use it to integrate with speech. Are these the areas that, psycholinguists have always found about where in the brain language is processed? Are those same areas, or processing gesture is completely done in some other areas, such as in motor and visual areas, for example? Because the integrated view assumes that speech and gesture would actually share similar neural processes. So one of the techniques we used was the M400 paradigm. So in the field of neurobiology of language, since 1980s, we know that an ERP component, M400, is sensitive to semantic comprehension of words into a previous context. For example, if you hear something like the pizza was too hot to eat, so 400 milliseconds after you hear the word eat, there is a change in negative voltage of the brain signal that indexes that some semantic integration of eat has happened in relation to previous context. How do we know this? Because if you hear words like drink or cry, which does not fit to the context, this M400 amplitude is even greater. And there's a difference, for example, between a mismatching word to context versus a matching word into context. So this difference is called the M400 effect. And it tells us that the harder a word is to integrate to a previous context, then there is an M400 effect. So in our multimodal research, we want to see whether if you see also a gesture mismatching to a speech or a word, do we see similar types of neural processing? So we gave people the examples you have seen before, either matching speech and gesture or mismatching speech and gesture. For example, they would see a chopping gesture and they would hear the word twist. And we looked at the measured ERPs to the word, depending on whether the gesture was matching or mismatching to the word. So again, like the previous example I've shown you, we found an M400 effect. So the amplitude of the M400 component was larger if there was a mismatching gesture to the speech than speech and gesture was mismatching. So it's exactly in the same place and exactly in the same direction that one would expect if gesture is exactly processed like a spoken word, for example. So this gives us the first indication that speech and gesture actually share similar neural processing networks. And also we have done in our lab, we have done a lot of fMRI experiments trying to see which areas of the brain are involved processing information from gesture in the context of matching or mismatching speech, or gesture adds information to the speech. And these results have been replicated. We were the first actually to find this out, but there have been a lot of confirmation from different labs around the world. So when people see a gesture, understand its meaning, and incorporate it into a sentence context, they use very similar areas that we know of from spoken language comprehension. So these are mostly left brain networks and frontal areas, left inferior frontal cortex, known also as the Broca's area, as well as the left posterior temporal areas, more specifically SDS and MTG. So again, this shows us that speech and gesture share similar also brain areas in processing semantic information. So all these studies that I've shown you actually have used some kind of mismatch paradigms. Then you can say that maybe these are not the ways that people process language in everyday context. And most of the time we have blocked the face from the stimulus materials. So then in the new set of experiments that we have done, we have also tried to see whether we find similar effects when we see also people's faces and lips, and we have also used a speech in noise paradigm to do so that it's not a mismatch paradigm, because also hearing speech in noise is something we do a lot, at least we used to do when we were having nice conversations in restaurants and bars and so on, that we cannot do anymore. But at least in the Zoom conversations that we have and so on, I mean, still, you know, it's hard to see, to hear speech in its full capacity. So we wanted to create a paradigm where speech would be noisy, and then to what extent gesture would help to reduce the ambiguity in the speech signal. And we wanted to see to what extent gesture actually, information from gesture is still picked up even when lips are there and face is there. This was quite important because we know from some eye tracking research that in face-to-face conversations, people don't look at each other's hands, but they look at the face, mostly to the eyes. So if they are not looking at the hands, maybe they don't even pick up any information from the hands. So just to be sure, we created new videos where the face was visible, lips were there, but the speech was degraded to see to what extent gestures help to disambiguate noisy speech. And this, we did a series of experiments with first language speakers, second language speakers, brain studies, and so on. This was all done in Linda Driver's thesis, which was finished a year ago. I'll tell you a little bit of the research that she had done, but there is much more. We predicted that, given that, you know, in the, you know, when you're watching someone like you're watching me right now, you can see their lips as well as hands. We would think that there would be different division of labor between the two, because lip movements give us information about phonological information linked to the speech, whereas gestures give us semantic information linked to the speech. So we thought that there would still an additional value of gesture in disambiguating speech and noise. So we constructed three types of conditions. So in one condition, there was speech in different degradation conditions as well as clear speech. So in one condition, we had speech, but lips were blocked. In the second condition, there was speech, but the lips were visible. And in the final condition, there was speech, lips were visible, and there was also gesture. So the speech was also sometimes clear, sometimes moderately noise vocoded, and sometimes severely noise vocoded. So our idea was that the more articulators that you have, the better the speech will be disambiguated in noise. So we gave people, again, very simple videos like this. They were always accompanied by some action word, just to make it simple. So here is an example from a moderate degradation, and these were all in Dutch. Okay, so people had to write down what they heard after they had seen these videos. And we calculated the number of correct responses and calculated some enhancement effects. So we calculated the enhancement from lips, and we also calculated separately enhancement from the hand gestures. So to what extent gesture contributed on top of seeing lips, and here what lips contributed on top of not seeing lips. And the results actually show that there was, of course, enhancement from the lips, as also shown from previous research, even though this was not a lot, actually. So maybe seeing the whole person in information pickup from the lips was much less, because in previous lip experiments in noise that they were shown only the mouth. So, but when you see the real person, maybe the information pickup from the lips is much less. But we have seen an additional effect from the gesture, even when the lips were there, and thus seeing both the lips and the gestures have actually helped much more disambiguating the speech in noise. So these results confirmed our expectation that even if you see someone's face, even if you don't look at their hands, you still pick up information from the hands and use it to disambiguate the information. So we have also done these studies with children and with older adults, and there is some variation in this. Not everybody does it in the same way. And we've also found that working verbal memory actually might modulate these effects. And I think these results also have implications for the, how we communicate with each other in the COVID era, where we have to wear masks. And of course, masks create a noise in the speech signal. So if we want the enhancement from the lips, we are better off, especially for older people or people with hearing problems. They are much better off wearing masks, clear masks, that the lips are visible. And if we can do it, or even if we do have clear masks, we better use gestures to enhance our speech wearing a mask, because gestures will then enhance the noise that's created by the mask. And if you also think of the social distancing, the need of gesture is even more needed. Actually, we have written a Mnemokinase link article on this, and if you're interested, I can send it to people. So then to wrap up, I've shown you some evidence for the model of a multimodal language use and processing. I have shown that speakers use multimodal ways of expressing their messages, and in doing so, they integrate them with linguistic encoding of information, both in their behavior as well as in their planning of the utterance. And they design their gestures as design their speech with communicative intent. And I've also shown you evidence that listeners and viewers in return integrate these multimodal information that's already given to them in integrated ways. They also integrate them automatically, probably, even though there is some individual variation in this. And in doing so, they also reduce ambiguity in the channels that kind of information is conveyed for them. And in doing so, they also benefit from the fact that I think speech and gesture share similar brain areas and neural correlates of processing. So I think all these results from the production and comprehension side show us that speech and gesture are part of an integrated system of communication, which has evolved through the years to be like that, allowing us to use language flexibly and adapt to different contexts and in different languages. And thanks to this multimodal advantage, hopefully in the new technological challenges of COVID eras or trying to communicate in different technological platforms, we will make use of the multimodal nature of our communicative and linguistic capacity. And of course, so far I've shown you information about iconic gestures and also mostly focusing on semantic aspects. But there's also more integration at the level of prosody, rhythm in gesture, and rhythm in speech that we are doing some work on, where how the rhythm in both modalities are connected to each other. Okay, and finally, I would like to say that this multimodal view of language has a lot of implications, and more than a unimodal view of language has, I think. First of all, it has implications for speech and language impairment therapies, where a lot of therapists around the world still believe in just training people on the speech channel. However, all the noise experiments I've shown you that they have to be trained for using the multimodal capacity of human communication to be able to function well in society. So training people with gestures or aphasic speakers or people with cochlear implants, and they need to be trained multimodally. And it has also implications for language teaching, for second language teaching, for immigrants, and so on and so forth. And this view can be also used to enhance, devise ways to enhance visual and auditory input segregation during living with COVID in the ways that I've shown you before with masks, but also, for example, right now there are a lot of discussions on how people should teach in Zoom environments. So I believe that using your gestures or looking at the camera or showing your communicative intent will enhance people's engagement in Zoom environments and obviously understand you better, and these Zoom teachings will be more beneficial if more multimodal cues are there. And finally, I think all the psycholinguistic, cognitive, and neural underpinnings of how gestures are produced with speech and understood, it might help developing more efficient communication ways with artificial virtual agents and robots, etc. And all the areas probably that you're working with, then I hope that the work I presented to you is somewhat relevant to, let's say, building avatars that can gesture and interact and, as well. So I hope I'm not over time, and I would like to thank the members of my lab and all the funding agencies I've had support from so far, and the Language and Interaction project that I'm currently part of. And thanks for your attention, and I hope you're still there because I don't see anybody, but I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
So I wasn't sure whether the internet was cut off or something. Okay.
Yeah, your talk had many interesting topics that can improve the multimodal human-machine communications. So we have many questions here, and let me select some of them. Okay, so the first question is, how many examples or how many different stories or gestures did you consider in the study comparing English versus Japanese or Turkish gesturing? So, am I clear?
How many gestures?
How many examples or how many different stories or gestures did you consider?
Oh, okay. Well, we use different paradigms. I mean, from the cartoon, we had things like the Sylvester was climbing up and things like that. But we also later on devised what we called as these geometric figures. So like a circle figure was rolling up a hill or coming down. And so we had, I don't know, 20 of those. And yeah, so this has been quite replicated, this effect, by different motion events. So it's not, I mean, I usually show this one event because that's where our traditional examples come from, but it is replicated by different events. I mean, I don't know how many, but I don't know, 20 or so.
Thank you. And the second question is, so there are taxonomies of gestures like iconic, indexical, or symbolic. So, so is the taxonomy sufficient granular to cover all possible gestures? For example, what about a gesture that in a given context helps the communicated party to select one possible path or message in the conversation among several possible such paths moderated by both conversants? Highly contextual and could be iconic or symbolic.
Right. So these are the gestures that have some meaning in them. So like visible, what I call as visible reference. So they refer to objects, actions, and motions in our discourse. But there could be also gestures that have to do with the interaction itself. For example, I can give the word to another person. So there's some gestures have to do with turn taking. Right, so I might index that now it's your turn, my turn, or this type of gesture that I described in the Italian guy when he's, oh, you know what I mean. So these what we call pragmatic. So a lot of gestures have to do with the pragmatics of the interactions. You know, the Italian gesture, like, oh, like, you know what I mean, and those kind of things. So those are more pragmatic gestures, we call them. So I didn't talk about them here. And there are the beat gestures that they don't have any meaning. So that's why I don't consider them within the group of visible reference. So I can just like use this beat when I have to emphasize something, for example. A lot of politicians make use of this, you know, Boris Johnson and Obama. They are very good at this because they kind of get your attention to the topicalized aspect of our talk. I think there are this, and then there are the metaphoric gestures, of course. So when I talk about more abstract concepts, I can put ideas in different parts of the space. Or I can talk about things about, let's say, the other day, the Dutch Prime Minister, he talked about his COVID plan that he said, okay, by the new regulations, we are going to hammer the virus or something. So this is a very abstract idea, you know, metaphoric idea to talk about how effective a regulation will be, and then he does a hammering gesture, but we call this a metaphoric gesture because it's about an abstract idea.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. The third question is, how do these results compare to research examining language and gestures from sign language speakers? There are a couple of questions about sign language.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we also do a lot of research on sign language that I don't have time to include here. Of course, sign languages have then one channel, right? So it's hard to talk about what's gesture, what is not gesture. But within one modality, sign languages also have properties that I have outlined in those two columns. You know, the more categorical, arbitrary mappings, linear, and then there are the all simultaneous, iconic, indexical. So they also have both types of representations in the sign language, but they do all these types of representations or ways of conveying information through one visual channel. So it's not that all the visual or simultaneous stuff belongs to gesture and then all the spoken stuff has other characteristics, but actually sign language through one modality, they can have different representational formats. So they can have, for example, linear ways of expressing information, but they could also have simultaneous, because they could put some information into the face, some information into the hands, and then they can package all of those in linearly or simultaneously. Actually, we have a new paper in 2020 in Cognition about how Italian signers do this. So what happens in sign languages is that the more articulators that you use, the more effective you can be. So instead of syntactic dependencies, for example, relative clauses and all that, they kind of use more and more articulators together to be most efficient in communication.
Thank you very much. So we have run out of time. So there are many more questions, but sorry, I couldn't.
Oh, okay.
So
is it possible to save them somewhere?